More and more people are waking up to the reality that Canada is in grave danger, that we are all in grave danger, that the environment is in grave danger, that the world is in grave danger as a whole, that Europe is increasingly looking like it's heading towards a shooting war with Russia. We are in a really bad situation in human history, and we have to be talking about these things to get the word around, to get public sentiment on side, to get public willingness to be ready to face what's coming. The only way we're going to get through it is to be ready to face it and be ready to face it together. All right, I'm Joey, only the Caribou Weather Dude, and this is another bad news show for you. Let's go.
There it is. This is bad news. My God. All right. Hey, pick it up. Yeah. I'll watch the video later. Hey, try mopping this.
First, I want to talk to you about a little segment that was on the Thom Hartmann program today. If you don't know who Thom Hartmann is, you can find him on YouTube. Thom Hartmann is I would call a skeptical humanist from the United States, has this program. And you're probably wondering, what is a skeptical humanist, Joey? Why are you bringing that up? Because people have been wondering, like, where do I stand? What is my philosophy? What is my worldview? So I'm going to let you in on something here before we go on. So this here would best describe myself and people like myself, people who have the value systems I have and the way I look at the world. People who would resonate with this would generally consider themselves to be skeptical humanists. They combine core tenets of humanism, which emphasizes human values and reason, with a strong emphasis on skepticism and critical thinking, particularly in evaluating claims, especially if they lack empirical evidence. So more detailed explanation. Humanism, the philosophy that emphasizes human interests, values, and potential, often rejecting supernatural or religious explanations of the world. Skepticism involves questioning claims and beliefs, especially those that lack evidence or are based on faith and dogma. Secular humanism, a common form of humanism that rejects supernaturalism and focuses on ethical and moral values based on reason and science. You're getting the idea here, right? Reason and evidence, questioning authority, ethical values, emphasis on the natural world. Okay, well, that's what probably best describes me and what I think best describes Thom Hartmann. Now, this is what Thom Hartmann had to say on his show today about U.S. plans to invade Canada. I think they're very, very concerning, and you need to take them seriously. Much like everything I've been saying lately, you need to take very seriously. In fact, pretty much, unless I'm being silly on the channel, you should be taking me friggin' seriously. Okay, let's watch this.
Donald Trump is trying to do to Canada and Greenland basically what Putin did to Ukraine. This is not my opinion that I'm going to share with you here. This is Malcolm Nance, who's been a guest on this program many times. I have so much respect for Malcolm. We should probably get him on more often. It's been probably a year since he's been with us. Although we're not, this is not a guest-heavy show. It's basically you and me. But I do like to get people on from time to time who are experts in things that I'm not an expert in. And Malcolm is one of them. And he was a former CIA officer or agent, I forget which, and a military guy. And he wrote this, and he's got a Substack newsletter, malcolmnance.substack.com, and it's titled Urgent Warning, Trump is planning to invade Canada and Greenland. And he says that within the next 6 to 18 months, that over that period of time, over the next year and a half, basically, Donald Trump is trying to do to Canada and Greenland basically what Putin did to Ukraine before the invasion, which is destabilize the country from within, politically destabilize it. Reach out to opposition politicians, particularly hardcore right-wing opposition politicians who would be favorable to merging Canada and Greenland with the United States, the same way that Putin installed, Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Putin oligarch, as the president of. He basically.
We got Daniel Smith going down to Florida to speak at PragerU. Great example. Certainly, we know that Trump has fully given his endorsement to Pierre Poilievre in the past.
Poured money, resources, and bots, social media bots, into that Ukrainian election and got his guy in charge of Ukraine until, of course, there was the Orange Revolution, which, according to Putin, we played a role in. But I digress. So what he's saying, what Nance is saying, is that the United States is going to engage in a campaign to politically destabilize Canada and politically destabilize Greenland and by extension Denmark, which, kind of owns Greenland, so that Canada and Greenland can become U.S. territories. And he suggests that at some point we may even actually invade Canada with special forces. He says special forces actions could seize key facilities against Canada's armed forces. It would come quickly with almost no warning. He says Trump and his cabinet are politically shaping the battle space right now.
You know this.
Trump the other day said, we pay hundreds of billions to subsidize Canada. Why? There's no reason. We don't need anything they have. We have unlimited energy. We should make our, quack, quack, quack. And then 48 hours later, he hits Canada with a 25% tariff, which is, in abeyance right now. Now, the one kind of good little glimmer here, I suppose, is that Canada has a new prime minister, or will soon.
This came up on the U.S. Congress website recently. It's a bill proposal to prohibit funds for the armed forces to engage in operations to invade or seize territory from Canada, the Republic of Panama, or the self-governing territory of Greenland. This is a bill that's on the table for Congress right now. So you can look this up yourself. Obviously, people within the U.S. Congress are taking it seriously because they're trying to already, within their own institutions, give some measure of pushback, ineffective as it may be. And we know before, Trudeau was finally done, Trump had reportedly told him that he doesn't believe the border between the U.S. and Canada is valid, and he wants to revisit it. He said he wants to bring Canada to its knees by driving us into economic ruin. Then there was this douchebag that was on the news. He's an economist, actually. Not an expert on the drug war, certainly. But this is what he's saying, and he's on the White House lawn, everybody. This is the lies he's saying from the White House lawn.
Core fairness issues. Let's just be fair. Whatever you do to us, we'll do to you. That's what he's asking for in April, and it's not a radical idea at all.
But let me ask, because I am confused now about what you're saying about this being a drug war, not a trade war. So let's just take Canada. Mm-hmm. I mean, you said Canada's shipping fentanyl to the United States. I mean, I don't think that's happening.
Shipping fentanyl to the United States.
Smuggled across the border. 1%. I mean, Canada's not a major source.
No, we're not a major source. 1% of your fentanyl.
Well, yes, they are a major source.
You are our major source.
In the Situation Room, I've seen photographs of fentanyl labs in Canada that the law enforcement folks were leaving alone. Canada's got a big.
He's saying there's labs he's seen photos of.
Toronto and see what it's like, and you'll see that.
And you don't. Homeless people in Toronto.
Frankly, we have intelligence that Mexican cartels operate in Canada as well.
Mexican cartels operate in Canada, do they?
Out of Canada and Mexico.
Okay, but if you're saying that this is an effort to make them crack down and it's worked,
it's working. Yes, it's working.
Then why are these tariffs the very same tariffs going back into effect on?
You're
April
trying
2nd?
to use reason.
Well,
How Trump's 51st state talk came to be seen as deadly serious. President Trump, in an early February call, challenged the border treaty between the two countries and told Trudeau he didn't like their shared water agreements. This was in the New York Times. After President Trump imposed tariffs on Canada on Tuesday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made an extraordinary statement that was largely lost in the fray of the moment. The excuse that he's giving for these tariffs today of fentanyl is completely bogus, completely unjustified, completely false, Mr. Trudeau told the news media in Ottawa. What he wants to see is a total collapse of the Canadian economy because that'll make it easier to annex us, he said. This is the story of how Mr. Trudeau went from thinking Mr. Trump was joking when he referred to him as governor and Canada as the 51st state in early December to publicly stating that Canada's closest ally and neighbor was implementing a strategy of crushing the country in order to take it over. The February calls. Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau spoke twice on February 3rd, once in the morning and again in the afternoon, as part of a discussion to stave off tariffs on Canadian exports. But those early February calls were not just about tariffs. The details of the conversation between the two leaders and subsequent discussion among top U.S. and Canadian officials have not been previously fully reported and were shared with the New York Times on condition of anonymity by 4 people with first-hand knowledge of their content. They did not want to be publicly identified discussing a sensitive topic. On those calls, President Trump laid out a long list of grievances he had with the trade relationship between the two countries, including Canada's protected dairy sector, the difficulty American banks face in doing business in Canada, and Canadian consumption taxes that Mr. Trump deems unfair because they make American goods more expensive. These are all bogus side discussions we could have. But anyways, he also brought up something much more fundamental. He told Mr. Trudeau he did not believe the treaty that demarcates the border between the two countries was valid, and he wants to revise the boundary. He offered no further explanation. The border treaty Mr. Trump referred to was established in 1908 and finalized the international boundary between Canada, then a British Dominion, and the United States. Mr. Trump also mentioned revisiting the sharing of lakes and rivers between the two nations, which is regulated by a number of treaties, a topic he's expressed interest in about the past. Canadian officials took Mr. Trump's comments seriously, not least because he had already publicly said he wanted to bring Canada to its knees. In a news conference on January 7th, before being inaugurated, Mr. Trump, responding to a question by a New York Times reporter about whether he was planning to use military force to annex Canada, said he planned to use economic force. The White House did not respond to a request for comment on the matter. During this second February 3rd call, Mr. Trudeau secured a 1-month postponement of the tariffs. This week, the U.S. tariffs came into effect without a fresh reprieve on Tuesday. They did eventually. Canada, in return, imposed its own tariffs on U.S. exports, plunging the two nations into a trade war. On Thursday, Mr. Trump granted Canada a month-long suspension on most of the tariffs. Okay, they got that in there. Glimpses of the rupture between Mr. Trump and Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Trump's aggressive plans for Canada have been becoming apparent over the past few months. The Toronto Star, a Canadian newspaper, has reported that Mr. Trump mentioned the 1908 border treaty in the early February call and other details from the conversation. And the Financial Times has reported that the discussions in the White House about removing Canada from a crucial intelligence alliance among the 5 nations. Now there's talk within the Five Eyes about removing the Americans as a matter of side discussion. Doubling down, it wasn't just the president talking about the border and waters with Mr. Trudeau that disturbed the Canadian side. The persistent social media reference to Canada as the 51st state and Mr. Trudeau as the governor had begun to grate both inside the Canadian government and more broadly. Well, Trump's remarks could be bluster or a negotiating tactic to pressure Canada into concessions on trade or security. That's bullshit. The Canadian side no longer believes that to be so. That's correct. And the realization that the Trump administration was taking a closer, more aggressive look at the relationship, one that tracked with those threats of annexation, sank in during subsequent calls between top Trump officials and Canadian counterparts. One such call was between Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick, who at the time had not yet been confirmed by the Senate, and Canada's Finance Minister Dominic LeBlanc. The two men had been communicating regularly since they had met at Mar-a-Lago, Mr. Trump's home and club in Florida, during Mr. Trudeau's visit there early in December. Mr. Lutnick called Mr. LeBlanc after the leaders had spoken on February 3rd and issued a devastating message. According to several people familiar with the call, Mr. Trump, he said, had come to realize that the relationship between the United States and Canada was governed by a slew of agreements and treaties that were easy to abandon. Mr. Trump was interested in doing just that, Mr. Lutnick said. He wants to abandon all treaties between us and them. He wanted to eject Canada out of the intelligence sharing group known as the Five Eyes. That includes Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, though it might end up being America getting ejected from it. He wanted to tear up the Great Lakes Agreement, and this is because already now American NATO doesn't want to give Americans intelligence because they're afraid it's going to end up going right back to the Russians now. And this is why the Five Eyes might actually eject the United States. He wanted to tear up the Great Lakes agreements and conventions between the two nations that lay out how they share and manage Lake Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and the water in Lake Ontario. He's also reviewing military cooperation between us, particularly the North American Aerospace Defense Command. A spokesperson for Mr. Lutnick did not respond to a request for comment. A spokesperson for Mr. LeBlanc declined to comment. In subsequent communications between senior Canadian officials and Trump advisors, the list of topics has come up again and again, making it hard for the Canadian government to dismiss them. The only soothing nerves has come from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Yeah, right. The 4 people familiar with the matter said Mr. Rubio refrained from delivering threats and recently dismissed the idea that the United States was looking at scrapping military cooperation. But Canada's politicians across the spectrum and Canadian society at large are afraid and deeply concerned. Yeah, we are. Your Foreign Affairs Minister yesterday characterized all this as a psychodrama. How would you characterize it? Thursday, Mr. Trudeau quipped ruefully. All right, let's look what Doug Ford had to say today. And it seems like he's becoming frustrated. I think Doug Ford feels very betrayed because he was very much engrossed with the Donald Trump sort of movement connected to it. And I think he personally feels betrayed by all this. I'm not saying I like Doug Ford really all that much, but hey, he's taken a very loud and visible stand, and he's the biggest, most powerful economic base in Ontario, in this country, right? So it's really important that he's been this loud. Let's hear what he said today.
For weeks now, we've been faced with so much uncertainty coming from President Trump. Each day brings new tariff threats. Now, President Trump is threatening tariffs on steel and aluminum. He's pointing his finger at dairy and lumber, shifting timelines, different excuses, chaos and confusion. It's hurting workers, it's hurting businesses, it's hurting investments, and it's hurting families on both sides of the border. It needs to end. That's why I've been crystal clear. Until these tariffs are off the table, until the threat of tariffs is gone for good, Ontario will not relent. We will not back down. Pausing some tariffs, making last-minute exemptions, it won't cut it. We need to end the chaos once and for all. We need to sit down, work together, and land a fair deal. A deal that gives businesses the confidence to invest. A deal that gives workers the security they need and deserve. Until then, Ontario will keep up the fight. We will apply maximum pressure to maximize our leverage. That's why today we're moving forward with a 25% surcharge on electricity exports. For the 1.5 million American homes and businesses that Ontario powers, homes and businesses in Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. This surcharge will cost families and businesses in these states up to $400,000 each and every single day. On an average, this will add around $100 per month to the bills of hardworking Americans. Let me be clear, I will not hesitate to increase this charge. If necessary, if the United States escalates, I will not hesitate to shut the electricity off completely. Believe me when I say I do not want to do this. I feel terrible for the American people because it's not the American people who started this trade war. It's one person who's responsible. That's President Trump. I'd rather be working together. I want to sell the U.S. more energy, more electricity, more critical minerals. I want to make Canada and the United States the richest, most successful, safest, most secure 2 countries on the planet. But as Premier, my number one job is to protect the people of Ontario and in hand protect the people of Canada. I will do whatever it takes. I will fight like I've never fought before to protect Ontario. Friends, none of this makes sense. Costly tariffs against your closest friends and allies do not make sense. The U.S. markets have lost trillions in value. Companies are second-guessing investments into the American economy. American workers' jobs are at risk as we speak right now. Cost of hardworking American families will only go up. It doesn't have to be this way. We are stronger when we work together. I hope we can get back to working together, creating jobs, growing our economies, lowering costs for families in both countries. We don't get there by easing up. We will remain strong. We will be relentless. We will do whatever it takes to protect Ontario.
In addition to these new retaliatory tariffs from China, Canada's tariffs on the U.S. are still in place. Last week, it put a 25% levy on things like beer, fruit and vegetables, shoes, cosmetics, and more. And today, Ontario starts charging a 25% surcharge on electricity to 3 U.S. states, Minnesota, Michigan, and New York. The tariff war and opposition to President Trump has actually unified Canadians. Listen to these remarks from Mark Carney, who's expected to be Canada's next prime minister. He was just elected to head the Liberal Party yesterday.
I got to tell you, I watched this whole speech
Soon,
and it was
potentially to
good.
be sworn in as PM.
The Canadian government has rightly retaliated and is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs that will have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact here in Canada. And my government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect.
Let's discuss with Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, which is the province that started to impose that surcharge on 1.5 million homes and businesses in the United States. He also ordered all U.S. alcohol to be removed from Ontario shelves. Premier, thank you so much for sharing part of the afternoon with us. What do you hope to achieve with this surcharge? What needs to happen for you to remove it?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on, Boris. And I start off every interview with telling Americans that Canadians love Americans. I love Americans. It's one person that's caused this problem, and that's President Trump. As he is putting
it's not
tariffs
all
on us,
true.
even if he says he's putting it on hold, there's still 60% of goods that are crossing the borders that will be tariffed, and it's hurting both economies. It's hurting the American economy. It's hurting the Canadian economy. Uncertainty is what people don't like hearing in general life, not to mention the markets are tumbling, and investors from around the world are looking twice at America and Canada to invest in. There's no reason for a recession. I call it the self-made Donald Trump recession. He ran on a mandate to lower prices, to make sure we didn't have inflation, to create more jobs, and it's backfired. So let's sit down at the table and let's start working on a new USMCA deal, even though President Trump said it was the greatest deal he's ever made. Nothing's changed, so I guess it's not the greatest deal now.
His argument would be that he's trying to remake the American economy to produce more goods that are currently imported into the U.S. here at home. With these electricity surcharges, you say that the move is designed to protect your province. The administration, if they see it as an escalation and they reciprocate with tariffs on lumber, steel, and dairy, ultimately, doesn't that hurt your constituents?
No, we're looking at negotiating through strength. If he cuts off the lumber or puts a tariff, do you know whose costs are going up? It's the American people that want to buy a home. They're going to pay more for their home, or steel that they need, or aluminum. That is only 16% of aluminum's manufactured in the U.S. They rely on over 60% aluminum to come down there for their goods. High-grade nickel coming out of Ontario. That 50% of the high-grade nickel for your military, aerospace, and manufacturing comes from Ontario. And the list keeps going on and on and on, not to mention the 4.3 million barrels of crude oil that we ship down every single day. So I believe in building an AMCAN fortress. Let's make sure that we focus on having the two greatest countries in the world, the most prosperous, the richest, the safest. The problem's not Canada, it's China right now. And he has to keep an eye on China.
I do want to ask you about the question of fairness, and specifically on one claim, because I've heard it from Trump and a number of officials in his administration, most recently Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. He argues that Canada has a 255% tariff on dairy imports. The administration has cited that over and over again. Is that number accurate? Do you think it's fair for American dairy farmers?
Well, what I'd like to do is sit down and discuss these issues with them at a USMCA table. What I will tell you this, if we take the 4.3 million barrels a day that we ship down there to keep your economy going off the balance sheet, the U.S. has a $56 billion surplus, a trade surplus with Canada. I'm okay with that. That's fine. Things were going fine. Everything was moving forward. Market was going up a little bit. Everyone was optimistic. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he wants to attack his closest neighbor and ally. And his number, I call their number one customer. You don't attack your number one customer and expect the results that he thought were going to happen. Protectionism does not work, especially between Canada and the U.S. Maybe you should take a page out of Ronald Reagan's book.
Premier, I do want to ask you about Mark Carney. He is in line to become the next prime minister. We saw Justin Trudeau's relationship with Trump evolve and then ultimately degrade. How do you think Mark Carney is going to approach President Trump?
Well, Mr. Carney is a very, very bright individual, and it's up to Mr. Carney to build that relationship with President Trump. They're both bright people. Let's make no mistake about it. Agree or disagree with
Trump's
President
not bright,
Trump?
dummy.
He understands finances. So does Mark Carney, and so do I. We're business people, and if we sit down around the table, we can resolve the problem and make sure that both countries prosper, like the likes of which this country's never seen, or the likes of which the U.S. has never seen, if we work together.
Anyways, friends, there you have it. Just a little recap on Monday, March the 10th's madness. And that will be ready for you for your morning coffee, I'm sure, here on Caribou Weather Dude YouTube channel. Hit like, share, subscribe. Just hitting over 7,000 subscribers, trying to get to 10,000 this year. Join the channel. Leave a thanks donation if you want. Help keep independent Canadian media people going. Okay, thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.